Thank you. Jonathan Brader.
Thank you for the opportunity to testify. I'm Jonathan Brader. I'm a counsel at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law. We have submitted written testimony that details our 4 big recommendations for how states can improve the business of running elections. These are modernizing voter registration, expanding in-person early voting, setting minimum standards for the management of polling place resources, and improving the design of ballots and the performance of machines. Due to limited time, I'm just going to talk about modernizing voter registration. Voter registration is the biggest single election administration problem that we have. As the commissioners are aware, there are 24 million registrations, that's 1 in 8 nationwide, that are either invalid or that contain serious errors. And on top of that, there are more than 50 million eligible Americans who are not registered to vote at all. This can stop a lot of people from voting. In 2008, up to 3 million were prevented from voting. Also, having flawed voter rolls is a threat to the integrity of our elections. And as Don Palmer from Virginia testified on the first panel, problems with registration can create all sorts of delays on election day when poll workers are trying to help voters who are either have problems on the registration or aren't on the rolls. This happens primarily because too many jurisdictions rely on paper-based voter registration. Having to use ink and paper forms that may contain incomplete or illegible information, and then having to have election officials enter that data creates lots of opportunities for the rolls to become flawed. And that is what results in all these needless barriers to voting, opportunities for fraud, and just generally an inability to run our elections in a smooth manner in the way we should be able to in the 21st century. After studying this, we recommend that states fix this, as I said, by modernizing voter registration. And that consists of 4 key improvements. Number 1, states should shift to electronic registration. That is, when eligible citizens who want to register to vote interact with state agencies like the DMV or public assistance offices, the agencies can transfer that information electronically, and it can be uploaded directly into the statewide database. Second, registration should be portable, meaning that when you're registered, you remain registered in the state as long as you reside there. Third, states should have online registration so that states can use online systems to register and also make updates. And fourth, states should have a safety net on election day so that when voters show up and there are problems on the polls, on the rolls, they can correct that and then vote a ballot that counts. I think we've already heard some of the benefits from this today. Elaine Manlove from Delaware explained how it saves money, and there are significant accuracy benefits. And of course, Commissioner Patrick can speak to this much better than I can because of her experience in Maricopa County. But another benefit that Ms. Manlove described was increased registration at public assistance agencies, which can help register people, but also help states comply with the NVRA requirements for agency-assisted recommendation, and that's another huge benefit. I just want to emphasize this is a bipartisan reform. It's been led by people in both parties, and it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. It is flexible. Again, I would refer you to our written testimony for this and the rest of our recommendations, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Donna Sauerberger.
Thank you so much for allowing us to speak to your commission. I am a member of the independent voting.org, and I've come from Maryland to tell you why I so passionately believe that basic election reforms, in addition to improving the efficiency of the polling station, are so important for establishing and maintaining an effective government that is responsive to the voters. As an American citizen, I'm appalled that our government seems so hopelessly paralyzed by partisan gridlock, and I believe that this begins in the election process. So I'm hopeful that you will use this opportunity to explore the deeper issues and address the problems with an election system that encourages political extremism. I have been a registered Democrat since my first election more than 40 years ago, but I became an independent voter a few months ago when I realized how much each party, including mine, clings to power rather than allowing and encouraging individual legislators to come to their own decision based on the needs of their constituents. And so you may ask, well, how does that relate to the election process? Well, when elections are arranged to maximize the effect of a certain party, then legislative representatives are less likely to feel the moderating pressure of a balanced constituency and more likely to buckle under the pressure of the party that helped them get elected. Primarily, as I understand it, this power is instituted in the election process in two ways. One is having the slate of candidates determined by primary elections that exclude voters who are not registered members of a given party, and this has been explained so eloquently by other speakers here. The second one is allowing the ruling party to draw district lines in such a way that favors the election of their candidates, and I'll speak to you from my experience in Maryland. Our district lines in Maryland look like a bag of worms fell onto the floor. I live in District 4, and if I travel southwest for a mile and a half, I enter District 5, which stretches for 15 miles to my right and 60 miles to my left. But if I continue traveling in the same direction for only 5 more miles, I'm back in District 4 again. And Stephen, who testified a moment ago, lives in District 3. He can leave his district, travel northwest through mine for about 12 miles, and then, surprise, he's back in District 3 again, which forms just an island stretching 5 to 10 miles to his right and his left. And if he continues only another 5 miles, he's back out of District 3. This does not reflect community lines. These lines were drawn to minimize the possibility of a balanced constituency, which maximizes the need for our legislators to respond only to the extremes. The redistricting process should be based on something that's not just out of the hands of the ruling party and not just bipartisan. It should be a nonpartisan system based on objective criteria. So in conclusion, I urge that these issues are important enough that I urge and request that the chairs of the commission invite the leadership of independentvoting.org to provide a special briefing to you to discuss the democracy concerns and appropriate remedies for independence leading to an efficient, responsive government through our election process. Thank you.
Thank you. KU.
Good afternoon. My name is Kay Kyung-sun Yu, and I'm a partner at the law firm Ahmed Zafrisan Smiler. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to this vital issue of great importance. I'm affiliated with a number of organizations dedicated to preserving voter rights. These include, and in the past have included, the Philadelphia Commission on Human Relations, the Asian Pacific American Bar Association of Pennsylvania, and the Southeastern Pennsylvania chapter of Americans for Democratic Action. However, I am appearing before you today not on behalf of any specific organization, but to speak from my own experience as an immigrant and as a naturalized citizen. I was born in Seoul, Korea, and I moved to the United States when I was a small child. My family's immigrant status was a source of great strife for our family. As a young teenager, I recall when I was shocked to find out that there were deportation notices for each one of the members of my family. I was terrified by the idea of being sent back to a country I did not remember and could not know. Fortunately for me, with the passage of the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, I became a permanent resident and ultimately a naturalized citizen of these United States. Tragically, the law came too late for my mother, who passed away just a year before the law passed in 1985. Perhaps it is because the right to vote was not a birthright for me that I've come to cherish this right to vote. I view it not only as my right, but as my responsibility. Specifically with respect to Asian Americans, we are the fastest growing minority group in the United States and constitute the largest percentage of new immigrants. More than 70% of Asian Americans, like me, are naturalized citizens. So I urge you to consider and pay attention to what has been spoken of already, that is language access, uniform federal regulation of polls, and civic education for an informed electorate. One last point that I would like to close with is that today Congress and the President are at the precipice of the first major immigration reform since the 1986 law. And regardless of how the final bill is written, millions of immigrants are likely to experience a new status as naturalized citizens. I ask this commission to urge the administration to actively recognize the voting and participatory potential of millions of new Americans and to safeguard the franchise for all citizens as part of comprehensive immigration reform. Thank you.
Thank you. Kyle Williamson.
Good afternoon. I would like to thank the Commission for having this hearing here and allowing us to be able to come and speak. My name is Kyle Williamson. I'm an independent voter, and I'm out here just speaking on behalf of myself and a lot of the issues that I've seen going on just in general with elections. Me personally, I vote in Exton, Pennsylvania, Chester County. Unlike many of the people here in this room who have testified before and others around the country, I don't run into the issues that they have. I'll go in and vote. Takes me less than a minute and a half. Walk in, the poll workers have donuts, coffee there for us. We go right in there, get our ballot, sign up, boom, right out of it. But that does not excuse myself and others to ignore the fact there are issues that are facing other people throughout the country that need to be addressed. And the main issue that I want to speak about are the laws that are being implemented by certain individuals and our state legislators that are set out to disenfranchise other voters. For example, our House Majority Leader, Mike Terzai, who sits up there and blatantly speaks out in public about the voter law that they implemented last year in 2012 as mainly sole purpose to help Governor Mitt Romney win Pennsylvania to give him a better chance to win the presidential election. Though Judge Simpson last year had postponed, and then Judge Berkeley this year again, I think about like a few weeks ago, postponed it again past these elections. Though it may seem constitutional by just looking at it on a piece of paper, the implementation of it into working policy disenfranchises a lot of voters. And though it doesn't hurt me individually, I know that it hurts my neighbor down the street or a family member that lives down here in Philadelphia. And that's, I just want to address that, I believe that any legislation that goes through that involves voting, which is for the people, should go through the people and not through a majority-held entity. You know what I mean? And that's basically all I have to say, and I would like to thank you for allowing me to speak.
Thanks very much. Numa St. Louis.
Good afternoon, chairs and commissioners. I am delighted to be here. Welcome to the birthplace of American democracy, Philadelphia. My name is Numa St. Louis. I'm a community activist and an executive board member of Americans for Democratic Action in the southeastern Pennsylvania region. I'm also a co-founder of the Haitian Professionals of Philadelphia and a commissioner on the Mayor's Commission on Afro-Caribbean Affairs. The right to vote is critical. It is imperative to our democracy. Free and fair elections is at the core of the American concept of democracy. It is a fundamental right. It must be safeguarded and protected. Our citizenry is at stake. In the last few years, we've seen a coordinated effort from Pennsylvania to Texas to North Carolina that seeks to roll back Americans' right to the ballot box. These particular efforts target certain segments of the electorate, including minorities, the disabled, the elderly, and college students, undermining their right to vote and denying them access to the ballot box on the false premise and pretext of rooting out voter fraud. There's been no evidence to substantiate that false claim. This sends an awful message to Americans in large, but particularly the immigrant community. I'm a first-generation American. In my family, and I cherish the right to the ballot box. In our home country of Haiti, we've seen the horrors and the pain that people go through to gain access to the vote. We want all Americans to be involved and empowered in the democratic process. But also, I want us to think about the ramifications of these laws. America has a long history of being a champion of democracy throughout the world. These laws that are being enacted to undermine our access to the voting booth sends a terrible message to the world. How do we look going around the world preaching the virtues of democracy, while at home we're undermining the rights for Americans to do just that? I think it's something we need to think about long and hard. We cannot preach the virtues of democracy on the world stage while undermining the right for Americans to vote. It impacts our standing in the world. It is our hope that this commission will help to implement sound recommendations that will safeguard the vote. The goal ought to be free and fair access to the ballot box and to maximize the number of Americans that can vote. Thank you.
Thank you. Nina Hamed.
Good afternoon. My name is Nina Ahmed, and I am the chair of the Mayor's Commission on Asian American Affairs in Philadelphia. Welcome to all of you to the city of brotherly love and sisterly affection. I thank all of you for giving me this opportunity to speak this afternoon. I'm here today to be a part of the solution to improve voter experience. Specifically, I'm here to help unpack some of the issues that impact voter participation within the Asian American community and the immigrant community at large. I am here today because I owe a debt of gratitude to the foot soldiers of democracy who sacrificed blood, sweat, and tears so that I, a woman of color, may have access to the ballot box. Asian Americans are one of the fastest growing minority groups in the country, according to the U.S. Census Bureau. The term Asian American is an umbrella term which includes East Asians, Southeast Asians, South Asians, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. Additionally, there are separate ethnic categories within these broad ones as well. The reason I'm outlining this issue of diversity within the Asian community is to underscore the need to disaggregate data so the barriers to voting within the disaggregate the data so the barriers to voting within each subgroup can be understood. I'm hopeful that your commission report to the President will specifically underscore the issues faced by those with limited English proficiency and living marginalized lives as perpetual foreigners, even though they're citizens. I request that your recommendation understand the nuance within this community and voter participation efforts are tailored with these realities in mind. As a chair of the commission, I have encountered difficulties that have been faced by the Asian American community, and there are a variety of reasons for the lack of participation of this community. One of them is the voter registration issue. Voter registration seems to be driven by candidates and hence fluctuate from cycle to cycle. If there was a concerted effort by building partnerships with advocacy organizations, the election integrity community, and other governmental agencies to invest a robust poll monitoring program and maximize voter outreach and education activities in underserved communities, I can guarantee you there will be an uptick in voter registration, which will result, hopefully, in increased voting. The other issue that has been addressed by many, I'm not going to spend time on, is the voter ID laws, which I hope are going to be repealed completely. We have Asian Americans who have come to this country as refugees and don't have documentation that they need in order to get their voter IDs. The other issue is the voting time frame. If we had Asian Americans are small business owners and are self-employed because of barriers to employment in general, and they don't have time to go on one day, wait all day long in long lines, facing untrained and unwelcoming poll workers, having no access to translators, which pose insurmountable barriers. Expanded access to absentee ballots, fewer restrictions to registered voters, and translated materials in multiple Asian languages would be extremely beneficial. And the last thing I would like to say is inclusion of stakeholders in decision-making capacities. Communicate that there's a seat at the table. I took a look at your commission here, the members here. We don't see any Asian Americans included. And I hope that will be rectified. I recommend that engaging marginalized groups always are reflected in who's at the table. So thank you very much for allowing me to testify.
Thank you. Susan Lerner. Nelson Diaz.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. I have my statement in writing just in case I don't finish. I am a retired judge. I'm on the President's Commission for White House Fellows, and I was also General Counsel to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. In 1972, together with the Puerto Rican Legal Defense Fund and Education Fund, I filed an action known as the Arroyo versus Tucker case, taken from a victory action in New York City, which was similarly repeated in New York State and New Jersey. Puerto Ricans are born American citizens, and when we get on the mainland, we have full voting rights. Spanish is the official language of Puerto Rico. Those of us who migrated here have a right to understand the ballot in Spanish. The federal courts have so ordered it, and it has opened the way for the 1975 Federal Voting Rights Act amendment securing the voting rights of all linguistic minorities throughout the country. This is to set the stage for the federal bilingual assistance provisions that ensured the benefits of Mexican Americans and Latino voters, and later to Asian Americans and Native Americans. In 2006, the Arroyo case was enforced by the Justice Department for failure to provide election information to citizens educated in Spanish in American flag schools, like in Puerto Rico, for violations of the Help America Vote Act of 2002 for failing to provide alternative language information to voters. In that effect, a bilingual program in many languages was established, including bilingual interpreters and alternative language information, which is still in force. The voting machines have been monitored when I was acting chairman of the Philadelphia Commission on Elections, when some of those translations were corrected as a result of the Anglo language. I have translated ballots in Philadelphia for more than 20 years while a judge of the Court of Common Pleas pro bono. As a result of these programs, registration and voting increased to the point that Puerto Rican voters in recent election outcomes in Florida was the largest increase in my 40 years of voter registration activity. As an American citizen, the process enables more hospitality for the voters, a process which they can understand and not feel foreigners in our own land. Voting is taken very seriously in Puerto Rico, but because of the attitude and intimidation that we face in America, we feel like foreigners in our own land. Voter ID is another aspect which you have heard, and Latinos continue to be intimidated by that process. In Pennsylvania, the backers of voter ID laws, as you know, from the history of those who have testified, was a political act by Mike Tarso. This has no...
Mr. Diaz.
This is my last sentence.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you. I feel like the Supreme Court there. This has no allegations of fraud. There have been no allegations of fraud on the voters since the new voter machine were instituted in Philadelphia. The most prevalent problem in the last national election was a lack of processing of registration of new voters. Even the fighters of the court urged that there was no violation and no fraud. I urge you to encourage and reinstitute Title V of the Voting Rights Act and to encourage early voting and mail voting as a means of helping working Latinos who are used to vote on Sundays, an opportunity that is outrageous in terms of the democracy. I have participated in the Committee just as yours in 1998, and the suggestion was that the voting be uniform.
Thank you. Kevin Subley.
Good afternoon. Thank you for your time and the opportunity to address this commission. On Election Day, I represent myself, one independent, nonpartisan vote. But today, in front of this commission, I represent those of my generation, referred to colloquially as millennials, who identify not as a Republican nor Democrat, but as free-minded, educated, opinionated, concerned American citizens. Come Election Day, we desire to vote for our preferred candidates based on their merits and our opinions alone. We should not have to ally with or against a particular party for the right to cast a ballot, as we do in Arizona. To vote, we should not have to declare an oath to anything but our country, as we do in Georgia. Having to vote against an unwanted candidate rather than for a desired candidate, as the Michigan system supports, is, I would suggest, a violation of our constitutional right to freedom of speech and association. Perhaps you are aware of a recent article in The Atlantic by Ron Fournier, The Outsiders, How Can Millennials Change Washington If They Hate It?, on the apparent rejection en masse of the U.S. political system by my generation. If not, I highly recommend reading it. Here are some notable statistics quoted by the article. Nearly half of my generation agree that, quote, politics has become too partisan. Nearly 1/3 agree that, quote, political involvement rarely has any tangible results. Only 16% disagree that politics today are no longer able to meet the challenges our country is facing. And 45% describe their political affiliation as independent. Again, nearly half of my generation belong to no political party. But this does not mean that we are apathetic. Rather, we are more involved in community betterment, but with other social institutions and at the exclusion of our own government. What does this have to do with election administration and this esteemed commission? Everything. Your ultimate mission is, after all, according to the executive order that founded this commission, to, quote, ensure that all eligible voters have the opportunity to cast their ballots without undue delay. Prohibition from casting a ballot based on political affiliation is a clear impairment of this opportunity. Independents are here today, just as we have been in August and July and June, voicing our concerns. We are structurally prohibited from casting our ballots in some states, and this failure must be addressed. For better or for worse, my generation is the future. Access to voting is the most fundamental aspect of political participation, and being blocked from it results in disillusionment with both political parties and our country's current system of democratic political process. We all desire a stronger government, society, and country. Include us so we can help. In fact, we demand it, we deserve no less, and the future of our country necessitates it. I look forward to reading your final report to President Obama in a few months. Please address this issue of political affiliation, prohibited access, and stifled freedom of speech in that report. Include the strong and growing voice of America's nonpartisan voters and advocate for a more open and inclusive voting process for all American voters. We're counting on you. Thank you.
Thank you. Will Gonzalez.
Buenas tardes. My name is Will Gonzalez. I'm the Executive Director of SEBA, a coalition of Latino community-based organizations in Philadelphia. I will focus my testimony on matters relating to the rights of limited English proficient populations, LEP populations, as Spanish speakers comprise the largest LEP population in the city of Philadelphia, and Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act applies to this jurisdiction for Spanish speakers. We respectfully request that the Commission include in its list of recommendations to the President that he ask the Attorney General of the United States to fortify the federal regulatory guidelines governing the implementation of the provisions of the Voting Rights Act regarding language minority groups. Those guidelines should compel the jurisdictions under its coverage to create LEP advisory boards that meet on a regular basis to help voters work collaboratively with local election officials, prohibit officials of a political party from taking part in the administration of interpreters at polling sites, and set a strong requirement for records and data that each covered jurisdiction must maintain and share with the public to document its actions to comply with the Voting Rights Act. Currently, the creation of LEP advisory boards is left to the discretion of each jurisdiction. Accordingly, forming such advisory boards is dependent on the mood of local officials. In jurisdictions that are not receptive to public participation in the administration of elections, community organizations and voters concerned about the voting rights of LEP individuals must exert large amounts of energy and expend resources just to engage election officials. Fortifying the federal regulatory guidelines to compel the creation of LEP advisory boards helps the community by creating a mechanism for election officials to provide quality services to LEP voters. LEP voters do not want to be passive receivers of services which, when forged and delivered without their active participation, do little to grant them equal access to the polls. The Justice Department understands the value of creating such advisory boards. It has required the creation of advisory boards and consent decrees that govern the resolution of some of its Voting Rights Act complaints. It mandated the creation of an advisory board of voters from the Spanish-speaking community of Philadelphia in the April 26, 2007 consent decree between the Philadelphia County Board of Elections and the Justice Department relating to the city's compliance under Section 203 of the Act. Unfortunately, the requirement of forming an advisory board did not live past the expiration of that consent decree. Today, we lack a formal LEP advisory board with strong channels of communication to Philadelphia's election officials. A more effective relationship between the LEP community and election officials in Philadelphia will eliminate the use of party officials to administer the provision of interpreters at polling sites. Officials of the Philadelphia City Commissioner's Office readily admit to relying on ward leaders to locate and deploy interpreters at polling sites. Ward leaders are part of the organization and management of their respective parties during elections in Philadelphia. People with such strong partisan ties should not have a prominent role in the use of interpreters at polling sites. Impartiality and avoidance of conflict of interest are pillars of the Code of Ethics of Interpretation. I cannot give you an example of an instance where an interpreter at a polling site was caught steering an LEP voter to cast a ballot for a particular candidate or prevented an LEP voter from casting a ballot as that voter saw fit. However, when it comes to matters as important as the right to vote and to laws as important as the Voting Rights Act, we must not only be vigilant against impropriety, but also against the appearance of impropriety. To conclude, just because a fox has yet to be caught eating a chick does not mean that foxes should continue to play a prominent role in guiding the henhouse. Thank you.
Anthony Williams.
Good afternoon. On August 16th, Commonwealth Court Judge Bernard McGinley barred enforcement of Pennsylvania's voter ID law until he makes a final ruling in the lawsuits challenging its constitutionality. The ACLU, the NAACP, and other groups filed the suit. I, as the deputy whip of the Democratic Caucus, as well as the chairman of the State Government Committee, filed an amicus brief on behalf of my caucus. The voter ID statute was signed into law on March 14, 2012, but it has yet to be enforced due to court challenges, administrative delays in educating voters in order to reduce the number that lack proper identification. For seniors, minorities, and the disabled, the voter ID law creates substantial hardships. For election officials, it burns valuable resources and produces an administrative nightmare. Independent testimony during the current court challenges put the number of Pennsylvanians who still lack identification to be approximately 500,000 people. At the same time, backers of the law could not produce a single documented case of in-person voter misrepresentation. To reduce the number of voters who lack ID, Pennsylvania has or will have to spend $6 million on implementation, including television, print, internet advertising, $1.5 million to mail a postcard to every home in Pennsylvania with a registered voter. Pennsylvania is using federal funds for that effort, funds that could be used for what they were intended: the expansion, access, the training, election officials, and improvement of efficiencies of elections. Voter ID does, in fact, the opposite of what the funds that this commission are intended to do. The voter ID requirement will make it more difficult to recruit and train poll workers in Pennsylvania, if it is even possible to train them. They are intended, in Pennsylvania, the accepted number of photo identifications include PennDOT, non-driver ID card, federal government, U.S. military, U.S. passport, municipal employee ID, student ID from a PA higher educational institution, and Pennsylvania's care facilities issued. I asked the members of the Commission to consider that there are 1,240 licensed personal home care facilities in Pennsylvania, including nearly 100 within a 5-mile radius of this hearing. Pennsylvania has roughly 300 institutions of higher learning or more than 500 campuses across Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania has more than 2,500 municipalities. With fewer than a half of voters taking part in most elections, I would agree that the Commission has an important task in finding ways to improve how we get folks to vote. But I would suggest to you that anyone with the ability to go through this type of critiquing of voter identification is almost impossible. Voter identification law, as it currently constructed in Pennsylvania, does the total opposite of what is intended, and that is for us to participate in a freely exercised republic and have a standard by which we can exercise that through our own free vote. Thank you.
Thank you. Whitney May.
Good afternoon. My name is Whitney May, and I work at the New Organizing Institute, a nonprofit based in Washington, D.C. And our election administration team is really tickled to be here today. Thank you for the opportunity to speak, Chairman and Commissioners. I appreciate the professional paths that have brought each of you to the Commission. Thank you for your comprehensive research and your attention to public commentary on election administration. I look forward to seeing what y'all produce to make elections better in our country. A little bit of background. I joined the election administration team at NOI in February of 2012. Prior to DC, I was a certified election administrator in Durham County, North Carolina. I came to election work in 2007 by way of a goat farm, your standard career path. And just for the public record, I'd like to state that a workday on a goat farm and a workday in a local election office are not terribly different. And manure is just really part of that story. Following Ben from the Fair Election Legal Network, I feel a little bit like an echo chamber for Robin Carnahan, but she really put together this brilliant framework that allows us to consider the complexity and the scope of delivering elections as a service, wherein as an election administrator, you work year-round, but your shop is only open a few days a year. You prepare for all of your customers to show up on one day. Your frontline employees are paid minimum wage. They work a 16 to 18-hour shift and on average are over 70 years old. And then your customers expect their experience to be a perfect 30 minutes or less. Really, when you think about it, the peaceful transition of power as a result of an election in our country is a modern miracle. Local election administrators are responsible for implementing election legislation, educating voters, designing materials, recruiting and training poll workers, our nation's largest one-day workforce, and properly equipping polling locations for all sorts of contingencies. As an election administrator in Durham, I was responsible for managing the budget as well as recruiting and training poll workers. I was 27, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, and determined to do a stellar job for my community. However, I didn't have a degree in election administration, and I learned by boldly doing, like so many election administrators, and often at the expense of efficiency and grace. Election administrators across the country face common challenges. We've all heard that here today. But little, if any, infrastructure currently exists to help overcome those challenges. At this precise moment, no one is successfully facilitating connections between administrators to share those solutions. As a result, jurisdictions are expending already limited resources, spinning and reinventing the wheel. The existence alone of this commission is legitimizing the work of election administrators everywhere. Thank you. Election administration has never been sexier. But elections are too important to stop here. At Acroyat earlier this year, we launched a knowledge network of local election administrators across our country. We're calling this network Electricity, a network that thrives on peer learning, that raises the professional standard for election administrators, and that promotes continuing education, a network of, by, and for local election administrators. It is our hope that you as a commission will encourage election administrators to engage with us. Thank you for your service, and thank you for allowing me to speak today.
Thank you. Seth Flaxman.
So thank you. My name is Seth Flaxman. I'm the co-founder and executive director of TurboVote. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan tech startup. And for the sake of full disclosure, I should say Commissioner Grayson also sits on our board. So our mission is to build a service where any American can sign up one time and then get all the help they need, staying registered to vote and voting in all of their elections, local to presidential, for the rest of their life, no matter where they move. And last year we had 200,000 voters across the country sign up for this service. What that means is that we track their election calendar and their deadlines. If they need to register to vote or vote by mail, we can mail them a physical copy of a voter registration form or their state's vote by mail application already filled out, includes a pre-stamped envelope already addressed to their local election office, so all they have to do is sign it and stuff it in an envelope. We send text and email reminders to make sure they send these forms by the deadline, and then if they're voting by mail, we'll remind them to send their ballot back on time, and if they're voting in person, we'd send a reminder like, tomorrow's election day, here's where your polling place is. The voters, though, that we're in contact with also contact us when they have issues and concerns. And what I think the Commission will find interesting is that the #1 type of issue that was reported to us in 2012 were around issues with voting by mail. Voters asking, has my ballot been mailed yet? When will my ballot arrive? Has my ballot arrived at the local election office already? And unfortunately, the most that we could do was give them the number for their local election administrator and suggest that they give them a call, which wasn't very satisfying. Then this year, we started doing research, reaching out to election officials, figuring out what technology do they need to improve their processes, and found out something very surprising, which is that they have the exact same problem. They also want to be able to track the ballots they're sending out through the mail system. They want to know, when is my ballot going to reach the voter? And when are waves of ballots going to be coming back to my office? And so we've decided to fix this problem. We're building a system that uses intelligent mail barcode tracking in order to allow election officials to track their ballots through the postal system and then communicate that information to voters. So I'm very excited that the administration of absentee ballots is one of the issues that the Commission is considering. One of the best ways to reduce issues at polling places is to have more Americans vote by mail, and one of the best ways to help Americans vote by mail is to improve Americans' confidence in that system. So I encourage the Commission to include in their recommendations a call to improve the accountability and transparency of vote-by-mail systems across the country. Thank you.
Thank you. Ellen Kaplan.
Good afternoon. I'm Ellen Madelman Kaplan. I'm Vice President and the Policy Director of the Nonpartisan Committee of 70, which is probably best known as the elections watchdog in Philadelphia since 1904. The Committee of 70's fight for fair and well-run elections, which, like I said, is now over a century old, is a year-round enterprise, but on every election day, 70 recruits and trains nonpartisan volunteers to go out to polling places all over Philadelphia. And in 2012, we did it in the 4 surrounding counties to help voters at the polls, resolve minor issues, and to refer more serious concerns to law enforcement who happen to sit at the Committee of 70's headquarters. We have hotline volunteers who on November 6, 2012, handled over 8,000 calls from voters all across Pennsylvania about issues they were encountering at the polling place. Let me start by saying that the Committee of 70 does support and hopes this commission will recommend many of the reforms that other people have talked about today that will make elections fairer and create greater voter access to polling all across Pennsylvania, including early voting, expedited and online voter registration. But here in Philadelphia, Putting some of these reforms in place would be like adding a GPS to a broken down Model T Ford. However, the Commission can really play a powerful role by using its bully pulpit to recommend standards for how local elections should be run, because it is at this level that most voters encounter voting and where they make their decisions whether or not to be lifetime voters. Our testimony today will talk a little bit about what happened on November 6, 2012, and let me just sum it up to say the election was probably the worst election in Philadelphia's history, certainly in my lifetime, which doesn't span the entire century of the Committee of 70s and districts, but I'm getting up there. An unprecedented 26,986 provisional ballots were cast, including over 12,000 by voters who were properly registered to vote, showed up at the correct polling place, and should have been permitted to use the voting machine. Over 5,000 of those voters' names were inexplicably missing from poll books or supplemental pages. 2 weeks before the election, over 28,000 voter registration applications remained unprocessed, and they weren't finished being processed until 4 days before November 6th. Almost 100 Republicans who were legally entitled to serve as minority inspectors at polling places were not permitted to sit by Democratic judges of elections, and court orders were required to seat them. Now, in this town, which, as you know, is heavily Democratic, almost 80% of the voters are Democrats, how would you feel if you were Republican in this town and you hear some of those things happening? These are the kind of...
Nonetheless, we need you to sum up, if you could.
These are the kinds of things that make voters distrustful of how voting works in Philadelphia. So we urge, again, this commission to set standards and issue a set of recommendations that are designed to result in local elections that conform with the most modern and up-to-date voting practices, are free of patronage and partisanship, are operated with the greatest efficiency, and by people who have an unwavering commitment to exemplary customer service.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Joseph D. Fleece.
Hello, my name is Joseph D. Felice. I'm the Executive Director of the Philadelphia Republican City Committee. I formerly worked as State Director of Election Day Operations for Mitt Romney for President, and I'm a political science professor here at LaSalle University. One word that came up constantly today was the word disenfranchisement. We've heard it a lot today, and I'm going to talk about disenfranchisement just a little bit differently, specifically disenfranchisement of Republican election board workers. We're not talking about poll workers. We're talking about court-appointed election board workers that Ms. Kaplan referred to earlier. Philadelphia, every election, Republicans show up to the polling place with a court order to work inside the polling place. They get paid by the city to work, and every year they're kicked out of the polls. Last year, we had over 30 kicked out of the polls Election Day morning at 6:55, right before the polls are about to open. This is a disenfranchisement of the right. Many of these people never came back to the polls to vote that day because they're intimidated. Specifically, African Americans were referred to as banana skins and, pardon the expression, house niggers for being Republicans in North Philly and West Philadelphia. That you don't hear about this kind of stuff regularly, specifically with the Republican Party. Another issue, because I don't have a lot of time, is issue here in Philadelphia we ran into, primary 2011, we had over 83 divisions in the city of Philadelphia had more votes than voters that showed to the polls in the primary. Barack Obama in 2012 received over 900 votes from the differential from the number of Democrat voters that showed the primary election. So if you had 200 divisions, he had more votes in those divisions than actual Democrats that showed to the polls. Some instances, you had a Republican that showed to the polls in the primary, and they never switched the machine to Republican, so they just they put it on Democrat, because in North and West Philadelphia, you're talking about 98% Democrat. In a situation like this, you could see why that would occur, but not to the tune of close to 1,000 or 83 precincts, which is 5% of the city of Philadelphia. And finally, I'll leave you with the story of Joe Cheeseborough. There's 2 Joe Cheeseboroughs registered in Philadelphia. same date of birth. They live about 5 blocks from each other. One lives in a 7-Eleven. The other one lives on a street that no longer exists. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who has not signed up who wishes to address the commission? Please.
Ladies and gentlemen of the commission, I am Daniel Ignatius Murphy, an organization of one founded in 1927. I'm here not to advocate nor editorialize about anything. I'm going to lay before you 8 thoughts I have for you to consider incident to your function of facilitating and increasing voter turnout. And I hope I can do it quickly enough so that there'll be time left over in the 3 minutes to enable you to ask questions. But I will go slowly because it seems to me my comments are not being recorded, as brilliant as they are. And
they are being webcast. We have a transcript copy of your comments.
I'm sorry, what?
We will have a transcript copy of your comments.
Oh, okay. Well, then I'll speak a little more rapidly, and maybe we can get a question or two. In any event, 8 points. 1, we should have Sunday elections. 2, being able to register when voting or via the internet. In Pennsylvania, you can now register via the internet, but we can't register when voting. Several states now permit you to register when voting. Vote by mail, and at the same time eliminate absentee voting, but permit ballots postmarked anywhere on or before Election Day, or if election is on a Sunday, postmark 1 day after the election. Oregon instituted the vote by mail system, and the complaint was that you didn't get the results in a tight election until maybe the Saturday after the election, but Oregon has not reverted to the old system. 4, permit voters to pick up ballots at multifarious locations in addition to applying for them at the local board of elections. 5, explore the technical possibility of voting by phone, as is now done in France, or vote via the internet. 6, require election board members to take a training course and pay them for the time involved. Ms. Kaplan of the Committee of 70 was pointing out that the Committee of 70 requires anyone acting on its behalf as an overseer at the polls must take a 1-hour course on the fundamentals of the election law. 7, eliminate pre-election residential time requirements, i.e. having to live in the precinct a given number of days prior to the election. And other speakers have advocated the fact, I got 5 seconds left, but hurry up. And 8, eliminate primaries and revert to party conventions as is now done in England. Oh, I have 14. Oh, I don't know how this clock works. Okay. In any event, is it all over?
It's all over. Afraid so. Time flies when you're having fun. Please.
Good afternoon. My name is Teresa Petosa, and although I happen to be one of those people taking the phone calls at Committee of 70, I take them for the Spanish-speaking callers. My comments today will be brief, and they're simply my own. And please excuse me for not having them prepared. I listened to everyone very carefully today, and some of you probably saw me in the first row really vehemently soaking it all in. What I'd like to leave you with is, very briefly, a laundry list of some of the really disturbing things that I have come across personally while standing in line to vote, or either taking a phone call or when I'm out in the field observing. Falsified ballots being handed out to help people to assist them to vote. people standing in front of polling places with pit bulls. Conversely, the new Black Panthers standing, walking person to person in the lines of those waiting, asking who they're going to vote for. Polling places closing at 5:30 because I don't have any childcare. Hurry up, get in here, we got to close. I've seen in my neighborhood of North Philadelphia, a very diverse neighborhood, mostly Hispanic, but also because we have the largest mosque in the city, we have many new Americans, Muslim Americans coming from Albania and North Africa. These are the things that they've brought to my attention. Distribution of pamphlets saying ex-cons have lost their right to vote. You can never vote. If you're delinquent on child care support, you're on a list and they'll find you when you show up at the polling places. Yes, you are a new American, but you are not a homeowner. If you are not a homeowner, you cannot vote. They check your name to see if you own the property that you live at. A man in a wheelchair, his battery died being sent from polling place to polling place because they couldn't find him on a list. We don't put the Spanish posters up here. You're the only Spanish speaker and you speak English. Voter assistants who help elderly voters, they don't even know who they voted for by the time they left. Minorities, as we've heard countless times here, I've watched them in countless numbers being turned away or being subjected to unfair criteria that no one else is. And perhaps maybe the worst, the smell of alcohol and marijuana piercing the polling place. I have only one thing. I'm asking, I'm begging, get the DOJ back into Philadelphia. I realize it's not within the orbit of your mandate to suggest that kind of funding, and I do understand. But I know that there could be some government funding that could arguably be best used beefing up the DOJ for this specific purpose in Philadelphia and in other major metropolitan areas that have the same problem. I thank you kindly for your patience.
Thank you. Anyone else wish to address the commission? If not, thank you all very much for coming. We appreciate it. I think on behalf of all the commissioners, we learned a great deal today, and we appreciate that.
I agree. Thank you very much.